Born on the margins of legitimacy, the secret daughter of a Rothschild, she would rise to become the countess who saved one of England's greatest estates. Lady Almina Herbert married into one of the oldest aristocratic families in Britain and rescued Highclere Castle from financial ruin. She financed daring expeditions to Egypt that uncovered the greatest archaeological discovery of the century. Yet behind the glittering facade of Edwardian grandeur lay whispers of scandal: an illicit affair with the last prince of the Sikh Empire, a sudden flight from her own home when she feared she might carry his child, and a husband whose death some dared to blame on a mummy's curse. But the drama did not end there. She transformed her ancestral home into wartime hospitals, refused royal honours, and later shocked society with an affair involving her husband's undertaker. Her name was dragged through one of the most explosive divorce trials in British history, so incendiary that the king himself was forced to intervene. And in the final, bitter twist, the very son she had protected cast her out of the castle she had once saved. This is the extraordinary scandal-laced story of Countess Lady Almina Herbert, a woman who moved between vaults of gold, desert tombs, and the highest circles of power, only to lose everything in the end. Some women are born with names carved in stone. Almina Victoria Marie Alexandra Wombwell was not one of them. She arrived on the 14th of August, 1876, in a London where names mattered more than anything, and hers didn't. On her birth certificate stood Captain Frederick Charles Wombwell, an old baronet whose fortune had drained away at the card table. He was a father in ink. He wasn't at her birth. He never came after. Everyone who mattered knew the truth. Sir Alfred de Rothschild was her father, the banker with diamond buttons on his waistcoats and orchestras in his drawing room. He owned Rembrandts, palaces, and more porcelain than Versailles. Yet he remained marked as an outsider. Too Jewish, too flamboyant for an England obsessed with bloodlines. Alfred adored Almina. He paid for her governesses, her writing lessons. Later, he promised her a dowry vast enough to rescue a failing estate. But he never gave her his name, other than in a cipher. Almina was the combination of Alfred and her mother's name, Mina. Illegitimacy in Victorian England was more than gossip. It was a stain with consequences. Almina had wealth without welcome. She was dazzling in reflection, absent from the family portrait. Marriage and Highclere. By the spring of 1895, Almina was 19 and dazzling, draped in Parisian silks. George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, was 29. Slim, courteous, Eton and Cambridge polished. He owned houses across 5 counties, dined with royalty. But appearances are liars. The House of Carnarvon was showing its seams. The estates were vast, but the debts vaster. Paintings hung straight, but plaster cracked behind silk wallpaper. George was shy, contemplative, more drawn to manuscripts than Parliament. He adored gadgets, early motor cars, photography. In time, with her money, he would fund the most famous archaeological discovery of the century. But in 1894, his excavation was not in Egypt. It was in Mayfair, and he was digging for a fortune. George invited Almina to Highclere. She saw it for the first time on a clear spring afternoon. The carriage came up the long drive beneath the cedars, and there it stood. Highclere Castle. Immense, impassive, impossible. 300 rooms. This was England itself. On the 26th of June 1895, Almina entered St. Margaret's Church on Alfred de Rothschild's arm. At the chancel stood George Herbert. His best friend, Prince Victor Duleep Singh, son of the last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire, stood as best man. In time, Victor's name would return in whispers. In a single morning, Almina crossed an invisible threshold. She entered illegitimate. She emerged as a countess. With George often travelling, Almina took control of Highclere by remaking it. Her dowry didn't just rescue the estate, it modernised it. She rewired the castle with electric lighting, rare in country houses at the time. She replaced threadbare carpets, upgraded the hot water system, purchased chandeliers from Paris. The drawing room, inspired by Marie Antoinette's private apartments, was dressed in green silk, hung with gilt mirrors, furnished with French antiques. She was not redecorating. She was conquering. The affair and pregnancy fear. The marriage had found its shape, formal, quiet, cold. What Almina would come to understand too late was that her husband had already withdrawn from intimacy. The retreat began in Cairo years earlier during a tour with Prince Victor. There, George contracted a venereal disease that nearly killed him. The infection left visible scars and something deeper, a lifelong aversion to physical closeness. Almina tried to entice him. She changed her hair. She softened her voice. She abandoned her French perfume, even her Parisian vowels, because he said her accent sounded like a governess trying to be clever. He never raised his voice, but he made his distaste known. She was too much of everything. Too pretty, too French, too rich, too Almina. And then came Victor. Prince Victor Albert J. Duleep Singh was the eldest son of Maharaja Duleep Singh, baptized with Queen Victoria herself as godmother. If George was frost, Victor was fire, witty, handsome, irreverent, a prince without a kingdom. He had always been George's shadow. They had gambled in Monte Carlo, lost fortunes in Paris. But if George was a brother, Almina was something else. When she met Victor, she was greeted not with obligation, but with attention. He noticed her hair. He noticed her gowns. He laughed at her jokes. He teased her in French, in the accent George found offensive. He was always at Highclere. Servants laid a place for him without asking. George did not object. Perhaps he was indifferent. Perhaps he was relieved. They were all very modern about it. There were 3 of them in the marriage. Society noticed. Whispers followed them from the Savoy to Ascot. By the winter of 1897, Prince Victor joined them on their honeymoon, a trip to Cairo. George kept mostly to archaeological digs. Victor wandered with Almina. She laughed more in those few weeks than she had in her first year of marriage. 9 months later, Almina gave birth to a son. Prince Victor was about to be married to Lady Anne Coventry. The marriage had been blessed by Queen Victoria herself. But the Queen had one condition: no children. And yet, around the same time, another plan was quietly set in motion. In 1898, in the quiet months before her due date, Almina rented a house in London, unmarked, discreet, a place to disappear if needed. If the child came out with Victor's features, if his skin bore the East, she would flee there. She had planned for scandal. She had prepared for flight. But when the moment came, she didn't need to run. On November 7th, 1898, Almina gave birth to a son, Henry. He was pale, healthy, a Herbert on paper, and a mystery behind the eyes. The staff at Highclere said nothing, but they knew. One nursemaid would later remark, "There was no shock in the room, only relief." Victor was named among the godparents. The boy's middle name quietly added, Victor. No one said it publicly. No one dared because the heir had fair skin, and that was enough. Egypt and Tutankhamun. By spring 1903, George found a new obsession: motorcars. He drove alone through Europe, ignoring speeding fines, laughing them away. Then he planned a solo drive to the spas at Wiesbaden. 3 days later, the telegram arrived. Accident. Serious. George unconscious. Come at once. Almina didn't scream. She read it twice, gave orders, and by dawn reached the Rhine. The clinic room was white-tiled, airless. George lay unconscious, his jaw broken, his wrist shattered, one eye swollen shut. Almina did not weep. She stepped forward, found the only patch of skin not bandaged, touched it, and in perfect German asked the surgeon what must be done. She dismissed the hotel suite and took a narrow room beside the clinic. She wired London for a better surgeon, summoned a lung specialist, slept in a chair, corrected dosages. By late summer they returned to England. George could walk only with help, leaning on a cane and more heavily on her. Then came the migraines, the cough, the long weeks of silence and shadow. She brought Dr. Marcus Johnny Johnson to Highclere, converted a wing, retrained the staff, dimmed the gas lights, and reset the rhythms of the household around convalescence. The English winter returned like punishment. George sat hunched by the fire, pale and wheezing. He was only 35, but he looked older. "What he needs," Dr. Johnson said plainly, "is sun, dry air, quiet." So in late 1903, Almina extracted her husband from England and took him to Egypt. They arrived in Cairo just before Christmas. At Shepherd's Hotel, George sat on the terrace by day. By night, they dined overlooking the Nile, and for the first time in months, he stood straighter. He breathed. Egypt healed them both. By March, George was walking unaided. A new curiosity arrived. One evening, he held up a postcard of statues buried in sand. "We should go to Luxor," he said. Each year they stayed longer. Each year his fascination deepened. George applied for an excavation license. Almina ordered canvas, chairs, folding tables. They dug for weeks. Dust, heat, nothing. Then a shout, a mummified cat wrapped in linen, teeth intact. Almina didn't laugh. She examined it with interest, handed George a flask and said, "Well, he'll need a name." No gold, no pharaoh, not yet. Back in London, Almina had plans. She funded more workers, hired a translator. By 1909, Howard Carter was chief excavator. Almina approved the salary, arranged housing, oversaw construction of a modest residence near the valley dubbed Castle Carter. She claimed no scholarship. She didn't argue over dynasties, but she paid the workers, kept the tent standing, kept the earl warm, kept the digger focused. What had begun as a hobby was now a pursuit. What had once been a marriage was now a working alliance. In the autumn of 1922, George left again. He travelled to Egypt with Evelyn and Carter. Almina stayed at Highclere. On the 4th of November, a cable arrived. Carter reports discovery, stone steps sealed entrance. She read it twice. She did not rush to Cairo. On November 26th, Carter opened the tomb. George was there. Evelyn was at his shoulder. Carter lit the candle, and the air was gold. "Can you see anything?" "Yes," Carter whispered. "Wonderful things." The photograph flashed around the world. Reporters flooded Cairo. Almina appeared only once at the library window. A photographer caught her silhouette behind the lace. It was printed beneath the headline, "The Countess Who Stayed Home." What they didn't say was this: the Countess had paid for everything. The hotel suites, the excavation equipment, the lunches under canvas, the salaries, the silk rope Carter used to lower himself into history. It had all come from her. The curse and husband's death. The tomb had been opened. The world had knelt, and then it struck. George had pricked a mosquito bite while shaving. A nothing wound, a small red mark just below the cheekbone. But in Egypt in 1923, a wound was not always a wound. March gave way to April, and the bite gave way to blood poisoning, then pneumonia. Almina did not hesitate. She left within the day. When she arrived, the Continental Hotel was hushed. Evelyn met her mother at the stairwell. "He's sleeping," she said. "No," Almina replied. He's waiting." The next 5 nights were the last of their marriage. Almina did not sleep. She sat beside the bed reading psalms and poetry. She wiped his brow, fed him water through a straw, held his hand when the pain made him gasp. Once in the early morning, he opened his eyes and whispered, "I have heard the call. I am preparing." She nodded and stayed. Then on the night of April 4th, the power in Cairo failed. The entire city went dark. In the flickering half-light, George breathed once, then again, then never again. It was 2 a.m., April 5th, 1923. Almina kissed his forehead, closed his eyes, and did not cry. At that same hour, back at Highclere, the Earl's favourite dog let out a howl and died. The newspapers seized on it. The blackout, the dog, the tomb, the curse. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle declared it a sign. Egyptian gods avenging their desecrated boy king. Reporters repeated the ancient phrase, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the pharaoh's rest." But what they missed was this. Almina had held his hand through it all. And now in Cairo, the woman who had bankrolled the greatest archaeological find of the age stood alone. War Hospital. August 1914 came, and the air collapsed. Mobilization. England braced itself. Almina moved like a woman who had already heard the echo. She dismissed the pianist booked for August, cancelled the pheasant order, spoke with Dr. Johnson about morphine, and then she opened the castle. Not to guests, to the wounded. By the 3rd week of September 1914, an ambulance arrived. Inside, a man, not dead, not whole. He was the first. They had cleared the Arundel bedroom days earlier. Out went the canopy bed. In came enamel basins, a rolling trolley, a surgery lamp. A line of brown bottles stood where a portrait had hung. Iodine, ether, carbolic. Almina dressed the beds herself, laid out pyjamas warmed on the radiator before dawn. When a soldier wept, she stayed. When one asked if he'd walk again, she only said, "You'll stand again, and when you do, you'll be standing in England." The nurses wore strawberry pink wool, not white. "Let them feel colour again," she said. One wrote home, "I thought I'd been sent to a dream, but then I saw the scar on the man beside me, and I knew this is not heaven. This is a woman's doing." By the end of 1915, the stretchers were arriving faster, the injuries deeper. In the winter fog of December, Almina packed the hospital into crates and moved the war to the capital. She took a townhouse, 5 stories, red brick. By January, she had installed an electric lift for moving the wounded, converted the top floor into a surgery suite, brought in an X-ray machine from Vienna. The wounded came in waves, but in 1917, a new sound reached her halls. Not marching boots, but crutches and the cough of pilots. The Royal Flying Corps had begun to fall from the sky. They came with burned hands, bandaged faces, eyes gone. These were not men who had been wounded beside their friends. They had fallen alone. Almina made the beds herself, milk compresses for the burns, silk pillows to soothe the neck. No mirrors, not in those rooms. She told one pilot, who had lost an eye and most of his cheek, "You still take up more space than a ghost, and you always will." He smiled. It cracked. The war ended on November 11th, 1918, but she kept the hospital open until the last patient stood. On February 15th, 1919, Lady Carnarvon's hospital quietly closed. She wrote to each family. She dismissed the nurses with personal letters of thanks. She was offered the CBE for her role in the war and quietly refused, claiming she was just doing her duty. Undertaker, scandal and divorce trial. Highclere had never been hers by blood, but she gave it everything. Now it was slipping through her fingers. Porchy, her son, was the new Earl, and with the title came the keys, the decisions. Porchy was never cruel. He was colder than that. He had never forgiven Tommy Frost, never forgiven the silent affair with his good friend. She had poured her fortune into the house, £50,000 from Rothschild to save it, more to keep it. She had built wards in its west wing, lit lanterns for orphans, hosted the wounded. And now she was being asked to go. Her riding gloves were moved to the dower house, her trunks packed by hands she did not know. One by one, the portraits she had hung were taken down. She lingered one last night. She walked the halls, hand-brushing the tapestries she'd saved from mould. She turned out the lamp. She did not write a farewell letter. As the gates opened, the house stood still. 300 rooms, not one for her. The castle she had saved had not saved her. 8 months later, she remarried. December 19, 1923, a grey Wednesday in London, a registry office. No lace, no tiaras, just Evelyn and 2 solicitors. The man was Lieutenant Colonel Ian Dennistoun, a guards officer, penniless, divorced. She gave him £90,000 to recover. Then she gave him her name. Society called it indecent. Porchy called it something worse. He did not attend. He never forgave. By marrying, Almina legally lost her title. No longer Countess, just Mrs. Dennistoun. It came in February, a solicitor's envelope. Inside, a summons. Dorothy Dennistoun, Ian's first wife, was suing for alimony promises and years of secrets. In the official records, it was styled Dennistoun versus Dennistoun. But the papers called it the dustbin trial. It began on March 3, 1925, before Justice McCarty. It would stretch for 17 days. Dorothy's lawyers produced letters, Almina's letters to Ian from before George's death. Notes full of tenderness and worse timing. What emerged in court was a parade of humiliation. Dorothy described how Ian had pimped her to a general in exchange for promotion. Almina admitted to paying tens of thousands of pounds to Dennistoun before their marriage, hiding wealth in Ian's name. As the case unfolded, Almina fainted in court and needed to be taken to the hospital. Ian's defense was worse. He called his ex-wife a liar, then claimed she had 7 lovers. The jury heard love letters read aloud. "Oh, girlie darling, I hate you using that lovely little body of yours as a gift, but I am so grateful." Every headline made Almina's name filthier. The Countess who bought a colonel. From Tutankhamun to tainted love. The royal family recoiled. King George said, "We have had too much filth aired in public." Almina funded the entire defence. In total, over £40,000 gone. The verdict came down. Dorothy received £472, a token sum. Women who had once embraced Almina now crossed the street. The dustbin trial had barely vanished when another scandal slipped in. Young American beauty to sue British officer, breach of promise. Within days, the details emerged. The officer, Ian Dennistoun. The claimant, Lois Meredith, a silent film actress from New York. She alleged that during the very months Ian was wooing Almina, he had also sworn himself to her. But this time, there was no courtroom. She paid Lois Meredith £30,000 directly. No questions, just a cheque. To society, this wasn't simply shame, it was confirmation. Porchy was incandescent. The jewels she was pawning, the Rothschild diamonds, the Egyptian relics, these were his inheritance. Now they were trickling out through Christie's. He told a friend, "She's not a woman anymore, she's a bank with a fading crest." At Highclere, he had her room sealed shut. No ceremony, just locked doors. Exile and final years. In 1950, the loan remained unpaid. Henry decided he was done playing dutiful son. He sued her, demanding repayment from his own mother. Privately, he called her a crook. Publicly, he turned over everything: receipts, account books, auction slips. Investigators found that Almina owed more than £22,000 in unpaid taxes. With her other debts, her liabilities exceeded £30,000. There was nothing left to sell. In July of 1951, the courts declared her bankrupt. Her son never spoke to her again. Her room at Highclere remained locked and sealed until his death 40 years later. The government issued her £60 a week. She moved to Cleve near Bristol into a converted farm outbuilding, 2 bedrooms, 1 coal fireplace, no electricity. Almina sat by the window reading the racing papers in gloves she never removed. By 1954, she was nearly 78. Her grandson, Henry Porchy, was persuaded. He bought her a modest home, 19 Hampton Road in Bristol. She lived there for the next 15 years, widow, pensioner, tenant. Almina never let another man cross her threshold. She withdrew, converted quietly to Roman Catholicism like her mother, found solace in ceremony and silence. The Bristol cabbies knew who she was. They waited to make sure she reached the door. She kept some small luxuries: a chauffeur-driven Morris Oxford, a fur collar carefully brushed. Slowly, as scandal faded, some old friends returned. Enough to justify an annual New Year's Eve party. Then in April 1969, tragedy struck. Throughout her life, she had always feared chicken bones. No bones in the chicken, not ever, I won't die that way. It became her superstition, her obsession. And yet, in April 1969, the mistake was made. A home-cooked chicken stew. The meat wasn't checked. A small shard of cartilage lodged in her throat. Her governess tried to help. She couldn't. The ambulance took 20 minutes. At Frenchay Hospital, surgeons removed a section of her esophagus. She lingered in post-op. 3 weeks. The nurses did not know who she was. And then, on May 8, 1969, she died, aged 93, alone, not with tiaras, not with scandal, just a woman in a quiet hospital bed. There are no monuments to Almina Herbert, no statue in the gardens of Highclere. When people speak of the boy king, they speak of Carter and Carnarvon, but not of the woman who paid for the tomb to be found. They praise the castle's grandeur, but not the heiress who rescued it from ruin. In the end, she was locked out of the very dynasty she had once revived. But what a life she led. An illegitimate child in search of legitimacy. A teenage bride crowned with expectation. A wartime nurse who turned dowries into donations. Who gave so much she died with almost nothing. She funded the discovery that lit the world's imagination. She nursed the wounded of 2 world wars. Not as Lady Carnarvon, but as Almina. Just Almina, the girl who had once longed to belong, who gave away the riches of a Rothschild for the chance to matter. She turned down as commander of the Order of the British Empire quietly. She never sought titles, only purpose. And when the debts closed in, and the scandals whispered, and the doors to Highclere slammed shut, she did not rage. And then, alone in a hospital bed with no tiaras, no headlines, and no name on the door, she died. But hers was a life that mattered. Was Almina's life a triumph of resilience or a tale of reckless entitlement? Was she a true patron of greatness or merely buying her place in history? Why, in your view, has history forgotten her? If this story moved you, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. We uncover the forgotten women who shaped history, one story at a time.